often when we don't have a deep awareness of the tradition and a deep awareness of the particular language of our ecclesiastical confessions, these things can slide. And then we go about using the language and assuming that we all know what each other means in the conversations, in the theological conversations, or if we're being examined at presbytery and you say God is without body parts or passions, sure, God is simple, right? And yet there isn't necessarily a deep awareness of what those phrases were designed to convey, and the battles that were fought to produce these statements, not only in the 17th century, but going all the way back to the ancient church and to the very texts upon which all of this rests in Scripture itself.
And as confessional originalists, I mean, part of our concern is not simply to find a way to plug in the terminology of the confessions, but to actually intend by that terminology what those divines who composed those confessions intended. And so part of that is going to require looking at their exegetical basis for their arguments, and their sort of broader theological rationale and their way of reasoning to those conclusions from principles revealed in either nature or Scripture, or both in a mixed article situation, and to kind of rehabilitate that whole way of thinking that led them to settle on that language in particular. I think that we are, if we're going to confess an historical confession, it is important that we understand what the intention of the writers of that confession was. And you're right, what we find out is that something like God without parts or something like God without passions it's language that indicates a whole way of thinking about divine being and about creaturely being, about infinitude and actuality, and on the other side, finitude and potentiality. And even that language right there is sort of it's still current, but perhaps we don't use it with the same kind of exactitude or precision that our forebears did. A lot of work, though, that's been going on. I actually got this at Westminster originally when I came to do a THM in church history under Carl Trueman. Carl was one to really push me to, ad fontes, to read the sources, to read them in context, and then with the help of Richard Muller and others to kind of situate that thinking into what had gone before it. And in the end, it turns out that God without body parts or passions is actually a very short phrase that is pulling a lot of freight behind it, and a lot of important freight that really protects and preserves an orthodox doctrine of God. You might think of, sometimes I like to think of those doctrines like simplicity is a doctrine. It's sort of like a sentinel doctrine. It's meant to guard a certain conviction that all Christians, even those who'd never heard of the doctrine of simplicity, hold, which is, if I could say, it's something like this: that we believe that nothing not God causes God to be or to do anything that he does.
Right.
I think if you can say it like that, the person in the pew agrees with that nothing not God makes God to be, nothing not God causes God to do, that there's no cause of divine being or actuality.
Right.
Simplicity or impassibility or even aseity, these are all, I like to say, these are all just the details. This is just how we guard that basic fundamental conviction of the creator-creature distinction. God is not a caused to be sort of being. Rather, he is the cause of all things, the sustainer of all things. Simplicity and these other doctrines are really ways of maintaining that.
Yeah.
And you might think, well, but I haven't heard of this doctrine. We haven't talked about this doctrine for hundreds of years. Have we really lost anything? Well, this little book, All That Is in God, big title, little book, I like to say. This little book is really kind of a bit of a manifesto in which I'm trying to say, yes, in fact, by dismissing the sentinel, by letting pure actuality or simplicity sort of take leave of our theology, in fact, all the things that it was intended to keep out have been, unbeknownst to us perhaps, slipping right into our theology and are now almost so commonplace that it seems strange to suggest that they don't belong.